Hello, in this video we are going to see the next type of method called class method. In the previous video we saw the instance method. So what is a class method? It is used to access or modify the class state. In method implementation, if we use only class variable, then such type of method we should declare as a class method. So when we are going to implement any method and whenever we are going to use only a class variables, then that method is called class method. Unlike instance method, we do not pass self as a first parameter to the method. We are passing class as a first parameter. So that is the differentiation between instance and class method. Class method is bound to the class and not to the object of a class. It can access only class variables. This is we are going to see in coding example what is the meaning of the class method is bound to the class and not to the object. It can modify the class state by changing the value of a class variable that will apply across all class object. This is also we are going to see in coding. Class method has a CLS as a first parameter which refers to the class. Class method can be called using class name dot method name as well as by using the object of a class. So there are two ways we can call the class method, using first this syntax class name dot method name or by using the object of that particular class. Any method we create in the class will automatically be created as an instance method. We must explicitly tell Python that the method that we are creating is a class method using a function called decorator or class method function. But remember, using or calling this class method decorator involves an additional memory allocation. To summarize all these points in one single screenshot, we can see here we have a class, then we have a class variable, then we have a constructor to initialize instant variables, not a class variables. Then we have a class method, and using this decorator we are initializing the class, and we are telling Python explicitly that this particular method is not an instance method, it is a class method. And how to access class variables, how to modify class variables, and how to call class methods, which we are going to see in the coding examples. First, don't need to worry about what is the decorator because we are going to cover that topic in the next sections in the advanced concept in Python decorator. So no need to worry about that now. So we are going to create a class method using a decorator, which is a class method. Let's see the coding. Here we are using the datetime library to calculate the current date. Then we have a class called student with a constructor to initialize instant variables, and then we have a method which accepts class as a first argument and then other two arguments, and you can see class method decorator here. So we are telling explicitly to Python that this particular method is not an instance method, this is a class method which accepts first parameter as a class, and here we are going to calculate the age and returning that particular new object. Return class with name and the age calculation, and then we have an instance method to show the instance variables. Then we created an object and initialize that object, and we call a show method to print the initial values, name and age. We can see the result. Jesa's age is 20 because we initialize with those values. Then we can create a new object using a factory method. So you can see that using the student dot calculate age, we are directly calling that using a class name, then the class method name with the parameters, and you can see Joy's age is 26. So in this example we just saw how to create a class method using a class method decorator, how to access that using only class name, and how to return that particular object, and how to display that object using factory method. Next we are going to see how to create a class method using class method function. The built-in function class method is used to convert a normal method into a class method. Class method is an inbuilt function in Python which returns a class method for a given function. Here we can see the class name school, then we have a class variable, and then we have a method inside a class. There is no constructor in it. And now we are going to convert this method into a class method. So you can see we used class name dot method name is equals to class method function and pass the parameter as class name dot function name. And we already know to call a class method we can directly use a class, so we use class name dot the class method name. And you can see the result, school name is ABC School. Just ignore typos and other spelling mistakes. And next we are going to see how we can access the class variables in a class method and how we can modify the value of a class variables. So class variables are shared by all instances of a class, which is object. Using a class method, we can modify the class state by changing the value of a class variable that will apply across all the class objects. So what it says, we can modify the class state, which means we can modify the class variable inside a class method. So which is we are going to see. So we have a class name student, then we have a class variable, then we have a constructor to initialize our instant variables, then we have a class method which we are going to use to change the class state, which is change the value of a class variable. And then we have an instance method to display all the variables. But here you can see for the instance method we just used, but here we can see for the instant variables we just use self. But to access class variable we have to use class name dot class variable name. Then we create an object for the student class with name as a JSA and age as a 20. And then we call this instance method to display all the instance variables and class variables. We can see the name is JSA, age is 20, and the school is ABC School because we already initialized this class variable with this default value. But in the next calling we are going to call this class method to change the class name to something else. So we can see using class name dot class method pass the updated school name, and you can see when we are again calling with the object we can see here, and this class method is going to update that ABC School with XYZ, and it is going to reflect across all the class objects, which is stated here, apply across all class objects. So when we are referring again with the same object and again calling that instance method, we are getting the different result because it is updated across all class objects. JSA 20 and the school is XYZ. So this is how we access the class variable inside a class method, and also we can modify the class state using class method inside a class method. Since we can access the class methods without using an object, we can directly call or access that using class name. We can create a simple class method without an object creating. And here is an example, your class name and then your class method, and using just simply a class name and dot your class method we can create a simple class method without object creating. So the next we are going to see class method access without initiating a class, so it will not run constructor this time. So for example we have a constructor and we did not create an object, so it will not run that constructor. So we are going to see this particular scenario here where we are not initiating the class and see what changes we can see. So we have a class, then we have a class variable called total objects is equal to 0. Then we have a constructor, and inside the constructor we are updating our class variable with +1. And then we have a class method to print the value of that class variable. And here we are not initializing the class, it means we are not creating the object. So we are directly calling this class method using class name. So class name dot class method, and you can see the result is 0 because it did not call this constructor because our class is not initialized. To initialize we need an object. You can see in the next calling also variable value is 0, the class variable value is 0, and the next calling the class variable value is still 0 because this constructor is not initialized. Next we are going to see what happens when we initialize that class with a constructor. You can see the same layout here, the class variable, then we have a constructor with modifying the class value with +1, and then we have a class method. In the first we create an object, so when we create an object this value changes. From 0 it will change to 1 by just using this line, and then we call this class method, which is just going to print whatever the value inside this class variable, it is going to give you 1. Then we create this new object obj2, it is again going to add 1 plus inside that class variable, so it is going to print 2, and in the next iteration it is going to print 3. So this is the difference between previous and this code, that without initializing and with initializing the class, what is the state of a class variable. Now we are going to see the class method in inheritance with a special conditions. Now we are going to see class method in inheritance. No need to worry about what is an inheritance and what is the code in detail right now. In the upcoming section we are going to see the inheritance in detail. So right now just stick with the code, what it defines and what is the meaning of that code. So when the class method is a base class, and when we create an object of a child class and with the same attribute name, what happens we are going to see here. So you can see here the class name is my class, then we have a class member, then we have a constructor which is going to add +1 value to a class member or a class variable. Then we have a class method to print or display that class variable. And for this particular class, this is the base class. So here, and to create it, and this is how we create a child of that base class. Class, what is the name of that child class, which is CC class, and then in the parentheses pass the base class name, which is my class. And then inside that we are going to define the same class member which we defined for the base class. So you can see here this class member is same, and this is the special condition we just talked about, like when we create the object of a child class, but when we are going to create the object for this particular class, what is going to happen. So let's see. So for the base class we created an object and call this class method, and we are going to see it is going to return 1. You can see the 1 value is written. Then we created another object for the base class and again call this class method, and we also know it is going to print 2. And in the object 3 we are again calling this same scenario, and it is going to return the value 3 for this class variable. But the special case we are talking about when we create an object of a child class. So let's see, we created the object of a child class. So this thing, we created the object of a child class, and when we use the same class variable class member name inside a child class, and when we try to access that, we can see with the same, for the child class object we can see the value it returned is 0, and when we call this particular class name which is inside a base class, it is going to change the value of that class to 0. A class method is bound to the class and not to the object of a class. So you can see here class method is only bound to the class, not to the class object, and you can see here when the value of the object is changes, it changes across all. You can see here the result is 0 0. In the next scenario we are going to see the when class method is a base class and when we create an object of a child class, but right now we are going to use different attribute names. So we can see here in this example, here is a total object and here is a total object new, and we are going to repeat the same scenario, create or initialize the object for the base class. It is going to change the value of this class member total objects to 1, 2 and 3, and we can see here in this 1, 2, 3 is printed. But when we create an object for the child class and try to access the class variable of that child class, you can see it is initialized to 0, it is going to give you 0. But when we try to access the class variable of a base class, and you can see here the value of that is changed from 3 to 4, You can see right now when we create an object 3, the value of that class variable was 3, but when we initialize the child class, the value of that object class variable changes from 3 to 4 because it also initializes this class, and it means it initializes this constructor and it changes that value of that class member from 3 to 4. So these are the two scenarios related to inheritance, class method, base class, child class with same attribute name, which is same class variable and different class variable name. Next we are going to see class method in inheritance. So whenever we derive a class from a parent class that has a class method, then it creates the correct instance of a derived class. It's in the code. We have a class called vehicle, then we have a class variable called brand name, which is initialized to BMW. Then we have a constructor for this base class or parent class with instance variable name and price. Then we have a class method inside a parent or base class, which is going to return a new object with some calculation. Then we have an instance method to show the instance variables. And then we have our inheritance here. We create a derived class, which is a child class, from this base class. And inside that, we have an instance method which is going to perform some operation and display a message. So what happens when I create an object of a child class or derived class? So you can see here car, the name of the child class, and then I pass the two parameters which are same for the base class or parent class. So you can see here I can create an object of a child class with an correct instance with the same value of a base class or parent class. Now when I access the instance method of a base class, it is going to give me the name and the price is BMW X5 65 3 times 0. And now let's try to call the class method of a base class using the class name of a child class. And you can see here we use the child class name dot class method and BMW X5 and 65 3 times 0 as the parameter. And now when you try to call the instance method, and you can see here after doing the calculation, it is going to return the value BMW X5 48753 times 0. Next we are going to see how we can dynamically add class method to a class. Here also same, we are going to use class method function to add a new method to a class. We have a class named student, then we have a constructor, then we have an instance method, then we have a method which is outside a class which we are going to add. So how we can add this particular method which is outside a class to a class method? You can see here we use the class name dot method name which is outside the class, then class method function, and we pass the name of a method which is outside the class. And now since it is added to a class method, it is going to use the class variable as well. You can see here it uses the class variable called school name, and it is going to display below exercise for ABC school. This is how we add dynamically a class method to a class. Then how to delete dynamically a class method? Just like what we did for instance method, we are going to repeat the same here. So here the two options, first using DL operator and another using delete attribute method. So first let's see using delete operator. So we have the class, we have a constructor, we have a class method, then we initialize our class, and then we try to call class method and print some values of a class variable. But how to delete a class method? So use del and class name dot that class method name, and you can see here when we try to call that class method, it is going to give you an attribute error. Next we are going to see how we can delete the class method using delete attribute. Repeat the same process which we did for instance method. Create a class, have a constructor in it, have a class method in that, create an object, initialize the class, then try to access the class method and print some values, and then using delete attribute like del a well tr, and then class name comma the single quote the name of a class method, and it is going to delete that class method. But when you try to access that, it is going to give you an attribute error. This is how we are going to delete the class method using delete operator and delete attribute method. Thank you.